Thank you all for joining us. This session is entitled 2020 Vision for Global Meat Clouded by Extraordinary Storms. And we're going to have a deep dive into international markets. And this is so important for HCC because back in 2017, when we revised our strategy, one of the major planks of that strategy was to develop export markets still further. We've been very successful in that, and I think 2019 was probably a record year for lamb exports, certainly in the 2000s anyway. But clearly, we are very dependent on the EU market, and as we've said in earlier sessions, we need to diversify away from those markets. And so what I hope Richard is going to tell us is where the opportunities may lie. So just to tell you a little bit about Richard, he works for an organization called GIRA, as you can see on his presentation there. And GIRA is one of the preeminent market research and analysis companies in our sector. And it's been in existence for 40 years and been doing this sterling work for 40 years. And Richard has been working for them for 25 years. And I know Richard really well. I've listened to him many times. He's always worth a listen. And he always adds some insight that you wouldn't ordinarily know. And so I'm delighted to hand over to Richard, and he's going to tell us what's happening in international meat markets.
I am a director of GIRA. I've been analysing international meat markets for a long time, and I am running through a little presentation outline, really trying to give a perspective of absolutely extraordinary worldwide meat market conditions at the moment, which none of us have encountered before. There are extraordinary things happening which affect all of us wherever we happen to be and whatever meat we produce. So that's where I'm going in this speech. I'm going to talk about Asian ASF of being an absolutely massive driver on the worldwide meat system. I'm going to talk about COVID a little bit, and then I'm going to dive into China and put a lot of emphasis on what's happening in China and in pork, and on the implications of that to the beef market and to the sheep meat market and to the supply of those meats from all quarters of the world, and then come to some conclusions about the sheep trade and a Q&A session. And let me kick off. So this chart shows worldwide meat consumption broken down by the species over a nice long period of time, and I hope my cursor is pointing in the right direction. It shows good growth of meat consumption over a long time until we come to what seems like a little cliff edge in 2019, which is all to do with the ASF crisis and the loss of pork supply in China and Southeast Asia, which has removed an enormous volume of meat from the market. And I'm going to come on to this, but we have a crisis in worldwide meat supply and demand now because of ASF, and it will recover. And that's my story. And my story is the major beneficiary here will actually be the chicken industry. There will be some recovery of pork, and this will do good things for us in the world of beef and sheep. But in the grand scheme of things of volume, we are a minor player in an enormous protein market. To ASF, there is a massive problem in China and through the whole of Southeast Asia, through Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia. It's even in South Korea. It went across the demilitarized zone. I won't trouble you with the detail other than the point I want to emphasize is that the problem is massive in terms of the number of pigs which have died and been culled because of fear of ASF. And the second part of my story here on ASF is that we're not immune from this in Europe. We have an ASF problem in the wild boar of Eastern Europe, which is spread from Russia, but in Eastern Europe through the Baltics, through Poland, big problem in Romania at the moment, and it has hopped across Poland with unfortunate speed and then across the border into Germany, which we were all expecting. But it's important because it has led to the German pig industry being blocked from most of its non-EU markets, and therefore their pork is slushing back into the European market, and it has an important influence upon meat supply within Europe, and it affects everybody, but particularly the pig farmers. So I want to bang home the enormity of this problem. This chart, it was drawn by us last year. We're in the middle of doing our forecasts again at the moment, but it's legitimate to use it. This chart is showing the relative size of pork production worldwide versus poultry and beef and sheep, and bang home the points that obviously poultry and pork are much bigger supply industries than beef and sheep meat. And there has been a massive problem in the pork supply of China, -16%, -10% impact from China on worldwide pork supply. The numbers are enormous, and I'm going to document them in a minute. And the major beneficiary of that loss of pork is the chicken industry, which can respond quite quickly in producing more chicken for a market which is short of protein. It's good for us in beef, it's good for us in sheep meat, but our producers can't respond very quickly to an earthquake in the meat supply. So let me move on and just document this again. We have in 2019 and 2020 a significant decrease in production, in consumption, and a growth of trade. And don't bother to be lost in the detail of the chart. The importance is in the words. Big decrease of production, which forces a decrease in worldwide meat consumption. It means that there's very strong Asian import demand for meat, and big growth in volume of meat traded there. And the knock-on effect of that, which we were expecting, was that there would be a very big boost to the meat prices worldwide, all meat prices, retail prices, wholesale prices coming back mainly in the form of higher producer prices. And that was the world which we were absolutely expecting before we were hammered by another tragedy, which was the Kovid crisis. This is what was going to happen, and the expectation was that surge in prices, which went on for quite a long time because of the shortage of meat in Asia, would lead to supernormal profitability for pig farmers in particular, but also for chicken farmers, and there would be a benign effect onto beef and sheep. Everybody would have better profitability than they were expecting, and the normal producer reaction to that is that everybody produces more. And that's fine for as long as that import demand exists into China in particular. But the moment that it starts to subside, then you've got a big problem of a lot more meat in the world which is looking for a home. And that was the original storm scene which we were depicting here. And the whole world of meat being more and more reliant upon China, which is risky because the Chinese are very political. They have a managed market. They have very big commercial interests in that market, and they manipulate things to suit themselves. And if one is over reliant on the Chinese market without them having a compelling reason to need you, it's risky. And the other point to make about China very clearly is it's generally quite nice if there aren't too many other politics affected, sort of implicated in dealing with the Chinese. So, for instance, the New Zealanders are sort of rather neutral and not terribly important politically to the Chinese, and it's not surprising that they've had privileged access to the Chinese market for a number of years and have lower tariffs than everybody else, and they're doing great business there. Anyway, that was before the impact of Covid, and Covid in China, which was the first shock in the first quarter of this year, which ruined their import demand for a short period of time, blocked their shipping passages, and then obviously Covid went on and spread around the rest of the world and has been immensely damaging in every period of time that one could choose to look at. I'm going to move on to that now. So COVID, clearly it's a worldwide problem. You don't need me to ponder on that, apart from to say that it has an immediate demand shock effect in enforcing the closure of food service and a transfer of demand into retail. It's disruptive of the meat industry in terms of workers within meat factories in particular, and it will lead to a number of other demand shocks through the next few years, which will generally not be very helpful to us in the meat industry, because meat demand is very closely associated with disposable income, and clearly that's going to be falling in the near future, and problems arise from that. Let me move on. What has clearly happened? I'm going to have to skip this slide. We have an absolute shift in the purchase of meat from food service to retail. So there's been a splendid retail surge, and in this chart here, I'm just showing the retail growth in the United States through the second quarter of the year, and we're sort of evening out at round about 20% volume gain through retail because of the closure of food service. That then subsided through the summer, but with lockdown here again, we've got the same effect in Europe and in the United States now, with retail surging and food service being compromised. And we are heading towards a rather dismal global economic climate of unemployment, lower disposable income, and all the tax consequences which will come from that. And it will not, I'm afraid, be helpful for meat demand and for premium meats such as veal and sheep meat in particular. Another point from COVID is it's had an influence on currency, and I just want to show this. This is a little index chart of a number of currencies showed against the US dollar over a nice long period of time. And I just want to bang home the point that there are two important countries for which their currencies have been hugely weak over the last 4 or 5 years since the oil crisis, and again through the impact of COVID. And it's the Russian ruble and the Brazilian real. And there are two very important consequences of that on the world market. One is that the Russians cannot afford to import meat. They have a very weak currency. They can't afford to import meat anymore. They don't really want to. And what they would like to do is to export meat, including pork and poultry in particular, even beef. And their weak currency makes them rather more competitive at doing that than they would otherwise have been. The other story is Brazil. The Brazilian real is extremely weak. The Brazilian economy is very weak, and therefore domestic meat demand in Brazil is weak. And the Brazilians are extremely competitive exporters of all the main meats, of pork, of chicken, and of beef. They're an importer of sheep meat, so we don't need to worry about them there. But they don't have a currency which will encourage them to import so much sheep meat from Uruguay as they have in the last few years. But that's a minor issue. What's important is their enthusiasm to export beef, chicken, pork at aggressive prices to any markets into which they've got access, and that's not going to be reversed soon. Now back to China. This is a chart showing the Chinese pork consumption and other meat consumption, and you can see the impact of their enormous ASF problem in pork supply, which has hammered their pork consumption. It's favouring chicken, it's favouring fish, it's favouring beef, and it's favouring sheep meat. And we are in beef and sheep meat, we're way down at the bottom of the curve in terms of what the Chinese eat. But I want to emphasize that the red line here is showing beef. There is a growing demand for beef in China. It's been growing over a long time with the rising middle class. It's the same story for sheep meat. It's a rising consumption, and it's strong at the moment because of the enormous shortage of pork in the market, and it's leading to a surge in import volume of all the meats into China insofar as they're available. And I'm going to move on quickly into some other charts on China. That is a chart showing rising retail prices. The purple one here is pork. You needn't ponder on the detail other than to understand that the price has more than doubled. The retail price has more than doubled. It's really an important item for the Chinese. The price of beef has gone up strongly in this period, and the price of chicken has also gone up, but it's clearly much cheaper than the other meats. This is the Chinese beef balance, and I'm going to come in a second to the sheep balance. This is again my story of rising demand. This shows rising consumption. We're expecting that trend to continue. Rising consumption of beef in China to over 10 million tons, which is nearly as much as the Americans eat. They eat 12 million tons. Production of beef in China hasn't been able to respond to this. They're not efficient producers of beef, and we have a very solidly rising trend of rising import volumes for beef, which goes on into the future at prices which are attractive, and from all the main exporters of beef. The Chinese have been increasing the number of countries who are registered to supply beef. They've been licensing more plants. They want more beef supply from a range of origins, and they've enabled that. And we're sort of pretty confident that that import demand for China will persist in the future. This is not a short-term event. This is solid demand for beef and solid demand for sheep meat. It's the same story. The numbers are huge. China is the biggest sheep meat market in the world. Its consumption has been rising. As it happens, its production has risen as well, because the prices have risen sufficiently in China to motivate very many people to produce more lamb and mutton and goat meat in China. But it's not enough, and imports have been rising, and imports would probably have risen more than this were that supply to be available from Australia and New Zealand, which are the dominant suppliers of sheep meat around the world. But it's been going to China, and you can see that very, very clearly in the chart here, showing a nice time series of rising overall volume of sheep meat to China from both New Zealand and from Australia at a price which has risen as well. And we're confident of the future. It should not crash. If it looks rather stable, that's because the supply is limiting. It's not the demand which is limiting this trade. It's the supply from Australia and New Zealand which is limiting the trade to China. And now, back in global big picture sheep meat, we're looking at the global trade of sheep meat, and I'm charting it by major shippers. So this is in the dark purple here is Australia. They are the largest export shipper of lamb and mutton, but they're bigger than New Zealand. Here's New Zealand up here, and you have to spot that they absolutely dominate the world trade, and that their export volumes have not been growing because they are constrained in their production. In the case of Australia, they're just recovering from a catastrophic drought through much of the eastern part of Australia and South Australia and Victoria and New South Wales. They're in recovery mode now, strong recovery mode, but that limits the availability of their meat into export.
Richard, I'm
the
going
other
to
point to
give you a
make
5-minute
very
warning.
clear visually to you, where's it going? It's going to China, it's going to some other Asian markets, it's going to the Middle East, and a tiny volume goes to the EU. American market is a very important market for them. It will not have thrived in this year of COVID with the restaurants being shut, but Australia has a reasonable balance of markets. They feel very shut out of the EU market and the UK by their limited quota. But the reality is also that they're limited in supply. Turn to New Zealand.
Richard, we've got about 5 minutes.
You have to spot the colours here again with an enormous proportion of New Zealand exports of lamb mainly, and also mutton now going to China. And obviously, as everybody knows well, they have a splendidly large quota to the EU, which will be split between the EU and the UK. But the volume which has been coming to Europe in total has been diminishing over the years because our demand has been somewhat weaker than the growing demand in the Asian markets.
Richard, can you hear me?
I'm going to move on to my conclusions now. Kevin is looking relieved. We do have a little technology problem in the sound repetition, which is going to make Q&A very tricky. Anyway, final thoughts, and then I'd love to participate in some questions, and I love that. COVID, it's really serious. It's not over yet by a very long way, and it's got terrible short, medium, and long-term economic effects, which is going to be damaging to us, especially in the marketing of premium meats. We have an enormous ASF problem from which the Chinese will recover relatively quickly over the next 2 to 3 to 4 years, because the price of pork is so high in China. It will encourage a production recovery, and it's so important to the government of China to fix this problem. Anyway, in the meantime, China is an absolutely all-important outlet for shippers of pork and chicken and beef from all over the world. China is the market which is extremely attractive for those with access and who can keep access. And that, as I've said, as I've made clear in the charts before, New Zealand and Australian beef, well, I need to say that carefully, sheep meat is flowing to China. Of course, the Australians have been suffering a little political backlash from the Chinese over their beef shipments to China at the moment. They annoyed the Chinese by asking where COVID came from, and the Chinese removed the export licenses for some rather important export slaughterhouses in Australia. My third point here is this is a sea of uncertainty for everybody, and the meat industry is even more uncertain than most industries. It's a very risky environment of recovering from a terrible COVID crisis and ASF. It's rather risky, and then overlaid on that we have Brexit, which gives another whole slew of issues which we have to face, and I'm going to come back onto that in a moment. I just want to make my fourth bullet point here is that there are some underlying and very strong market forces which apply and they still apply. They will continue to apply when COVID eventually goes away and its aftershock goes away. When we recover from ASF, we will be in a global market which is growing in terms of consumption. That will mainly be in the developing world, and it'll be for the cheaper meats, but we will be in a growing market. Chicken will be most favored, and it'll be the industrial production of that meat which is the type of production which mainly can respond to provide the meat to the markets which want it. And then, of course, we have all these sustainability challenges which are on absolutely everybody's agenda, maybe at a different level in different places, but very, very serious issues which we have to respond to. And as a little subplot at the bottom of the list is the development of meat alternatives, which we very certainly can't ignore. They're a noisy challenge at the moment. The products are getting better, they're getting cheaper, they will take a share of the protein market. And I come back to the last point here, which is we're actually incredibly lucky to be operating in a big domestic market. The British market is an important meat market. We have consumers who do have a preference for domestic origin, and we absolutely should continue to pay plenty of attention to looking after our important domestic market and making jolly sure that we've got a good share of that market, and in a portfolio, the domestic market in a portfolio with a portfolio of export markets, including the markets for sheep meat in the EU 27 and in the Middle East, and hopefully if we can get access to the North American market in a better way and the Asian markets. It's having a range of markets to which we have access, which is important, and that export market outlet for sheep meat is exceedingly important to us and worth nurturing. Our volumes are small, but they're important and are very well worth developing. And one only has to go back to think of the ghastly times of foot and mouth disease when we were shut off from our export markets to have a very clear understanding of what that will do to us.
Richard.
Kevin.
Richard, hi. Can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me?
Thank you for your attention.
Yeah. Richard, I don't think you can hear me, but let me just say that was such a whistle-stop tour, which has picked up most of the key issues that are important to us. And one of the things that I've taken out of that is that there's a really good volume and value market in China if we can get market access sorted in the next couple of years. I'm going to ask JP Garnier and Mike Gooding to hold their questions over to the next session, which is a panel session starting probably 5 minutes ago, which Richard is going to participate in. So you haven't lost your opportunity to question him, but I am going to have to close the session now. And thank you very much, Richard. That has been a truly fascinating tour of international markets. Thank you very much.